Eliza Warren pressed her face against the frozen ground, her 21-year-old body shattered by pain that reached deeper than bone, deeper than soul. The metallic taste of her own blood filled her mouth, where her split lip had torn open, and each breath sent fire through ribs that she knew were cracked. But physical pain was nothing compared to the agony tearing through her heart. The knowledge that the man she had loved, trusted, shared her bed with for 3 years, had ordered this brutality upon her. The snow beneath her was no longer white. It bloomed crimson where she had crawled, painting a grotesque trail of suffering across the pristine landscape. Her twin daughters lay wrapped in blood-stained cloth beside her 2 tiny bundles, whose shallow breathing was the only sound that mattered in this frozen hell. She pressed her ear to each small chest, counting heartbeats like desperate prayers to a God who seemed to have abandoned them all. Please live. Please don't die because of what I failed to give him. Please don't die because I'm not enough. The words her attackers had spoken burned in her memory like brands. Pike wants a grandson, not worthless girls. Your husband made his wishes plenty clear. Said girls are just mouths to feed, until they're old enough to breed more mouths. They had known exactly how to shatter her spirit, quoting Silas's own anxious words about family legacy, about meeting Harlan Pike's expectations for their future prosperity, about the weight of disappointment that had grown heavier with each passing month of her pregnancy. But there had been something else in Silas's behavior these past weeks. Something she had pushed from her mind, telling herself it was just worry about the coming birth. The way he would pace at night when he thought she was sleeping. The hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. The strange visitors who came to their homestead after dark, men whose faces she never quite saw, but whose voices carried an undertone of threat. She had asked him about it once, and he had pulled her close, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Just business, darling. Nothing for you to worry about." Now she understood. It had been about her, about their unborn children, about what would happen if she failed to produce the male heir that Pike required. Silas. Her husband's name tasted like poison now. How could he have sent these men to beat her unconscious for bearing daughters instead of sons? She had seen the worry in his eyes as her pregnancy progressed, the way he spoke of Harlan Pike's investment in their family's future, the nervous energy that kept him awake nights. But to order this brutality upon the woman he claimed to love? A sob escaped her throat, instantly crystallizing in the bitter air. Around Pine Needle, everyone knew Pike controlled more than just land. His railroad plans and mysterious business ventures required certain arrangements. Local families were expected to contribute to his grand vision of prosperity, and male heirs were apparently part of that contribution. She had never understood exactly what Pike needed children for, only that families who produced sons seemed to prosper under his protection, while those who didn't found themselves facing foreclosure, mysterious accidents, or worse. When her labor had begun 3 days ago, Pike's men had arrived at their homestead to wait for news. They expected celebration of a boy who would serve Pike's mysterious purposes. Instead, she had delivered twin girls. The beating had started before she could even hold her daughters properly. Rough hands had dragged her from the birthing bed while she screamed for Silas, but her husband was nowhere to be found. The men who pummeled her spoke his words with cruel accuracy, as if he had given them a script to follow. Should have produced what Pike needed. One had snarled before his boot connected with her ribs. Your husband said to make sure you understood girls are worse than useless. They're expensive mistakes that'll drain a man dry. Now she was dying in the snow, her daughters dying with her because she had failed to produce the male heir Pike demanded. Because she was not enough. Because her love, her devotion, her willingness to sacrifice everything for her family meant nothing against the simple biological lottery of gender. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the howling wind like salvation or damnation. She could no longer tell the difference. Eliza lifted her head with tremendous effort, squinting through the swirling snow. A lone rider approached through the white nightmare, a man on a sturdy mule sitting carefully to favor his right leg. Even through her fading vision, she recognized him. Jacob Hart. Lakota Hart, though he wasn't Indian, the nickname came from his years scouting in Dakota Territory, where he had learned to track and hunt alongside the Lakota people. Hart was a Civil War veteran in his late 30s, who kept to himself and spoke carefully, carrying old wounds, both visible and hidden. She had seen him in town occasionally, a weathered man with pale blue eyes that seemed to see too much, remember too much. He lived alone in a cabin outside town, surviving on his union pension and the occasional scouting job. Children whispered that he still woke screaming from nightmares about battles fought 13 years ago, though no adult had ever confirmed such gossip. Hart dismounted with obvious difficulty, his right leg stiff from an old bullet wound that had never healed properly. The injury had ended his military career and left him with a permanent limp, a constant reminder of the day Confederate shrapnel had torn through his leg during the Battle of Stones River. But it was another wound, deeper and less visible, that had shaped him more profoundly, the weight of promises made to dying men and the faces of people he couldn't save. The knowledge that survival often came at the cost of innocence. He moved toward her with the deliberate gait of a man who had learned to assess casualties quickly and thoroughly, his eyes taking in the scene with the methodical precision of someone who had seen too much violence, but refused to become numb to it. "Ma'am?" His voice was quiet, steady, carrying the soft drawl of someone who had learned to choose words carefully. He knelt beside the twins, first checking their breathing with gentle fingers before turning to her battered face. "Can you hear me?" Eliza managed a weak nod, her throat too damaged to speak clearly. "The babies are breathing strong. Little fighters." Hart pulled off his heavy buckskin coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth was like a gift from heaven itself. "What happened here?" "Pike wanted a grandson." She whispered each word, sending fresh pain through her damaged throat. "His men came after I gave birth to girls. Said Silas told them girls weren't worth the trouble of raising." Something flickered in Hart's pale blue eyes. Recognition perhaps mixed with something darker. Her face reminded him of another face from years past, one that still haunted his dreams. Titus Harper, her father, the land surveyor, who had nearly drowned in the spring floods 5 years back. Hart had pulled him from the rushing water, but it had been too late to save the man's life. Before dying in Hart's arms, Titus had gripped his rescuer's hand with surprising strength and gasped out a desperate plea. "Promise me you'll look after my Elizabeth if she ever needs protection. Promise me you won't let them destroy her like they've destroyed so many others." Hart had made that promise to a dying man, not fully understanding what they meant or what dangers might threaten a young woman in this remote territory. Now, looking down at Eliza's broken body and her newborn daughters, he began to understand. Pike's influence extended far beyond land speculation and railroad contracts. It reached into families, into bedrooms, into the most intimate decisions of life and death. Hart said, his voice carrying absolute certainty born of old promises and newer resolve. "You're coming with me." The words had barely left his mouth when rifle fire cracked across the prairie like whips of thunder. 3 shots in rapid succession from Pike's fence line, maybe 200 yards away. Snow exploded around them in deadly fountains. And Hart heard the distinctive whistle of bullets passing close enough to kill. Hart moved faster than his injured legs should have allowed muscle memory from countless skirmishes, overriding physical limitations. He grabbed his Spencer rifle from the mule's saddle, a veteran of the same war that had crippled him, and returned fire with measured precision. Not shooting to kill, but laying down cover fire with the practiced efficiency of a soldier who had learned that sometimes mercy was a luxury that got good people killed. "Can you move?" he asked, already lifting one of the twins with surprising gentleness for such large, scarred hands. "I think so." "Then we move right now." Hart hauled Eliza to her feet with his free arm, ignoring the way his old wound screamed in protest. The cold always made it worse, and the sudden exertion sent fire shooting from his knee to his hip. But pain was an old companion, and he had learned not to let it control his decisions. He half-carried, half-dragged her to his wooden sled, a simple but sturdy conveyance pulled by the same mule he road-built, to haul supplies across rough terrain, but now serving as an ambulance for the desperate. More shots cracked from the fence line closer now. Hart could see a rider moving to flank them, trying to cut off their escape route to town. His tactical mind, honed by 3 years of war and 10 years of frontier survival, kicked in automatically. Distance to cover 300 yards. Available concealment minimal. Enemy advantages, higher ground, multiple shooters' knowledge of local terrain. His advantages, experienced desperation, and the kind of cold fury that came from watching innocent people suffer at the hands of those who believed might made right. "Hold tight to those babies," he said, grabbing the mule's reins. His damaged leg buckled as he tried to mount the old injury, choosing the worst possible moment to remind him of his limitations. Cursing under his breath, he improvised, tying the reins to a nearby fence post and slapping the mule's rump with his hat. The animal bolted forward with surprising speed, snapping the wooden post free with a sharp crack that echoed across the prairie. The broken timbers swung wildly on the rope like a medieval flail, and Hart heard a cry of pain and surprise from behind them. Their pursuer's horse had been struck by the makeshift weapon, sending both rider and mount tumbling into the snow in a tangle of limbs and curses. In the racing sled, one of the twins began to wheeze her tiny lungs, struggling against the frigid air rushing past. The sound cut through Eliza's pain-fogged consciousness like a knife. She pressed both babies against her chest, trying to shield them with her body. But the smaller child's breathing was becoming labored, desperate. "She's not getting enough air," Eliza cried over the wind panic, giving strength to her damaged voice. Without taking his eyes off the treacherous path ahead, Hart reached back and grabbed a handful of clean snow. He rubbed it briskly against the baby's feet, the sudden shock causing her to gasp and cry, a sound that was music to everyone's ears because it meant she was fighting, breathing, living. "Field medicine," he explained, his voice carrying over the wind. "Learned it from a surgeon at Shiloh. Sometimes the body forgets how to fight when it's overwhelmed. Just needs a good shock to remember." Behind them, the gunfire had stopped, but Hart could see smoke rising from Pike's ranch house in the distance. No immediate pursuit followed, but he knew that was temporary. Pike would regroup, plan, and come after them with overwhelming force. They had bought time with luck and desperation, but not much of either. The town of Pine Needle appeared through the swirling snow like a mirage of civilization. A handful of wooden buildings huddled against the vast emptiness of the Wyoming prairie, looking small and fragile against the immensity of the landscape. Hart guided the sled toward a modest structure distinguished by a hand-painted sign that read, "Dr. A. Merriweather, Physician." It was one of the few buildings in town that didn't belong to Pike directly or indirectly, which made it both a sanctuary and a target. Dr. Abigail Merriweather's clinic smelled of carbolic acid, dried herbs, and something else, hope perhaps, or simply the stubborn human refusal to surrender to suffering. Hart kicked open the door and carried Eliza inside, while the twins remained wrapped in his coat. Small bundles of life that seemed impossibly fragile in the harsh world they had been born into. Abigail looked up from her desk, where she had been grinding medicines with a mortar and pestle, preparing for the endless stream of injuries and illnesses that frontier life brought to her door. She was a woman in her mid-30s, with graying brown hair pulled back severely, and intelligent brown eyes that had seen too much pain to be easily shocked. But the sight of Eliza's battered face made her jaw tighten with controlled fury. "Jacob Hart," she said, rising swiftly and clearing her examination table with efficient movements. "Give me the situation." Woman beaten nearly to death by Pike's men. Twin newborns, cold but breathing. need immediate attention for all three. Abigail had come to Pine Needle 2 years ago, fleeing something in her past that she never discussed openly. Rumors suggested she had been dismissed from a hospital in Chicago for treating patients who couldn't pay, or perhaps for refusing to perform procedures that violated her conscience. Whatever her reasons for coming to this remote corner of Wyoming territory, she had found purpose in serving people who had nowhere else to turn. Her presence in Pike's territory was tolerated, because even powerful men sometimes needed medical attention they couldn't get elsewhere. But that tolerance was always precarious. She lit additional oil lamps for better illumination and began her assessment with gentle but thorough hands, documenting each injury with the methodical precision of someone who understood that evidence might be needed later. "Who did this to you?" she asked while cleaning blood from Eliza's wounds with careful swabs. "Pike's men." Eliza managed her voice stronger now that she was warm and safe. "They came after I gave birth to girls instead of the boy Pike required. Said my husband told them girls weren't worth the trouble of raising." Abigail's hands stilled for a moment, and Hart saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or memories of other women who had suffered under Pike's twisted vision of progress. She had treated victims of his business arrangements before, though most were too frightened to speak openly about their injuries. "The babies appear healthy," she announced after examining each twin with gentle thoroughness. "Some exposure to cold, but no signs of permanent damage. They're fighters, both of them." She turned her attention to documenting Eliza's injuries in a leather-bound ledger, noting the pattern and severity of bruises with the careful precision of someone who understood that such records might someday be crucial evidence. "These marks on your wrists, you were restrained during the assault. Multiple hands, at least 3 different grip patterns. They held me down." Eliza whispered, the memory flooding back with nauseating clarity. "Said my husband wanted me to understand the consequences of disappointing Mr. Pike's expectations." Through the clinic's front window, Hart watched Sheriff Doolin ride slowly past his eyes, fixed on the building but making no move to investigate. Doolin was Pike's creature through and through, a man whose badge had been bought and paid for with regular contributions to his personal vices and gambling debts. His presence meant Pike knew exactly where they were, but for some reason wasn't moving immediately to reclaim his prizes. Other townspeople began arriving as word spread of the night's violence. Miss Ruth Fenwick, the schoolteacher, entered quietly with clean cloths and a jar of warm goat's milk for the babies. She was a spinster woman of 40, with kind eyes and capable hands, and the sort of person who asked no questions when help was desperately needed. Enoch Boyle appeared next, a thin farmer with worried eyes and work-calloused hands, who owed Pike money for seed and lived in constant fear of foreclosure. Pastor Josiah arrived last, maintaining the carefully neutral expression of a man who walked a fine line between Christian charity and political survival. Pike's donations kept the church roof from leaking after all. "Hart," Abigail said quietly, her trained eye noticing what others had missed. "Your leg is bleeding through your boot." Hart glanced down to see red staining the worn leather. The old Civil War wound had reopened during the rescue, aggravated by cold and sudden exertion. He had felt it tear during the sled chase, but had pushed the pain aside in favor of more pressing concerns. "It can wait until the women and children are safe." "It cannot wait, and you know it." Abigail's tone carried the authority of someone who had seen too many tough men die from infected wounds they thought they could ignore. "Sit down before you fall down and become another patient I have to worry about." Hart reluctantly took a chair, recognizing the futility of arguing with a determined physician. Eliza watched him remove his boot with obvious pain, revealing an angry wound that had been improperly healed for 13 years. The bullet fragment was still embedded in the muscle, a piece of Confederate shrapnel that Army surgeons had been unable to extract without risking permanent paralysis. "This will hurt considerably," Abigail warned, reaching for her sharpest scalpel and a bottle of whiskey that served as both anesthetic and antiseptic. "Already does," Hart replied with characteristic stoicism. But as Abigail began working on the infected tissue, memories flooded back unbidden. The Battle of Stones River, December 31st, 1862. The screams of wounded men in the freezing rain, the smell of gunpowder and blood mixing with Tennessee mud. Private Marcus Webb, barely 18, crying for his mother as Hart dragged him to safety behind a fallen tree. The boy had died anyway, and Hart had made another promise to another dying soul, promises that seemed to accumulate like unpaid debts, weighing on his conscience with each passing year. You earned that wound fighting to preserve the Union. Ruth observed carefully, feeding drops of warm milk to one of the twins. You've earned the right to curse if it hurts. Cursing won't make it heal any faster. Hart managed through gritted teeth, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. As Abigail worked with practiced efficiency, she questioned Eliza about the attack with the gentle persistence of someone who knew that details mattered. The picture that emerged was deeply disturbing. The attackers had known exactly what words would cause maximum emotional damage, quoting Eliza's husband's private anxieties about family legacy and Pike's expectations with devastating accuracy. "Did you see their faces clearly?" Abigail asked while cleaning the deepest cuts. "No. It was nearly dark and the pain made everything blurry. But I heard their voices clearly enough." Eliza paused her hand, moving unconsciously to a small tear in her red wool sleeve. "One of them tore my dress when he grabbed me. I felt something sharp catch the fabric." Through the window, Sheriff Doolin made another slow pass this time, stopping to confer with someone lurking in the shadows across the street. The conference was brief, but clearly meaningful. "He's waiting for orders," Hart observed, testing his newly bandaged leg and finding it slightly more stable. "Pike never acts without calculating every possible angle," Abigail said grimly. "He's probably planning his next move right now, trying to figure out how to handle this situation without creating more problems for himself." As if summoned by her words, heavy boots sounded on the clinic's front steps. The door opened without ceremony or courtesy, and Sheriff Doolin entered with two armed deputies, their hands resting meaningfully on their weapons. Doolin carried an official-looking document that rustled importantly in the sudden silence. "Dr. Meriwether Doolin," announced with a kind of false courtesy that fooled no one. "I'm here on official legal business that can't wait for morning." "What kind of legal business requires armed men at a medical clinic?" Abigail asked, positioning herself protectively between the lawmen and her patients. "Judge Baines has issued an emergency court order." Doolin replied, unfolding the paper and reading in the flat monotone of someone reciting words he didn't fully understand. "Whereas Eliza Warren has been deemed an unfit mother due to circumstances of improper birth supervision and lack of adequate male guardianship, and whereas the welfare of the minor children is of paramount concern to this community. The court hereby orders said minor children placed in the temporary custody of Mr. Harlan Pike until such time as proper arrangements can be established for their care and upbringing. That's not legitimate law," Abigail stated with the firm authority of someone who had studied medical jurisprudence. "Judge Baines lacks the authority to remove children from their mother without substantial cause, proper hearings, and due process of law. Says right here it's official and legally binding." Doolin replied, though he avoided making eye contact with anyone in the room. "I'm duly authorized to transfer the babies to Mr. Pike's ranch for appropriate care and supervision." Hart rose slowly from his chair, his hand resting with casual menace near the grip of his Colt revolver. The movement was subtle, almost lazy, but every person in the room understood its significance. Sheriff Hart said, in a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who had commanded men in battle, "I'd recommend very careful consideration of your next action." "You threatening a sworn officer of the law, Hart?" I'm advising a sworn officer that any attempt to touch those children will result in him requiring the services of an undertaker rather than a physician. The tension in the room crystallized like ice forming on a winter pond. Doolin's deputies shifted nervously, their hands drifting toward their weapons, while their eyes darted between Hart's steady gaze and the growing number of townspeople who had gathered in the clinic. Ruth continued feeding the babies as if nothing was happening, but her movements had become deliberate and controlled the careful motions of someone preparing for violence. After a long moment that stretched like eternity, Doolin stepped back toward the door. I'm giving you until sunrise to comply with this legal order. After that, I'll return with sufficient men to enforce it properly, and anyone who interferes will face charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy. After the sheriff and his men departed, silence filled the clinic except for the soft sounds of the babies and wind rattling the windows like skeletal fingers. That document isn't worth the paper it's written on, Abigail said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger. But Pike owns Judge Baines completely, and Doolin will follow whatever orders he's given, legal or not. Then we need to be gone before sunrise. Hart concluded, his tactical mind already working on the logistics of moving injured people across dangerous terrain in winter conditions. Abigail moved to a locked cabinet and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and carefully preserved. Eliza, this belonged to your father. He asked me to keep it secure until you reached full maturity or found yourself in desperate need of protection. Eliza accepted the envelope with trembling hands, recognizing her father's careful handwriting immediately. Her name was inscribed across the front in faded ink, for Elizabeth Harper Warren, from her loving father Titus Harper, to be opened only in her hour of greatest need. What's inside? Ruth asked, her curiosity evident despite the gravity of their situation. I honestly don't know, Abigail admitted. Your father was very specific about the conditions for opening it. He said you would recognize the proper moment when it arrived, and that the contents would provide either salvation or the means to fight for it. The moment is now, Eliza said with growing certainty, but Abigail stopped her with a gentle but firm hand. If these are legal documents, land deeds, contracts, anything with official standing, we need proper witnesses and notarization when they're opened. Otherwise, Pike's lawyers will claim forgery or fraud, and everything inside becomes worthless. Hart nodded slowly, his military experience extending to the bureaucratic warfare that often followed physical conflicts. There's a bank clerk in town named Thomas Weller. He's performed notary services before, and he has access to official seals. Can we trust him? Eliza asked. We can trust his self-interest. Hart replied with the cynical wisdom of someone who had learned to read men's motivations clearly. Pike holds the mortgage on Weller's house and probably half his debts besides. But I have something Pike doesn't possess. What's that? My Union Army pension. 13 years of payments saved up enough to clear Weller's obligations completely and buy his integrity along with his services. As dawn approached with the inexorable certainty of winter sunrise, the small group prepared to leave the temporary safety of the clinic. Hart's leg remained painful but functional, the infection properly drained and cleaned. The twins were warm and alert, accepting goat's milk from Ruth's patient ministrations with the healthy appetite of survivors. Where can we go that Pike's men won't find us? Eliza asked, her voice growing stronger as warmth and safety restored her courage. Enoch Boyle's farm. Hart decided after considering their limited options. He owes Pike money, which makes him scared, but he has a decent heart underneath the worry. And his place has a root cellar that could hide us temporarily. What if Pike's men track us there? Hart checked his rifle and revolver with the methodical precision of a professional soldier, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated his injured leg. Then we'll face that challenge when it arrives. One crisis at a time. The half-frozen river stretched before them like a sheet of deadly glass, beautiful and treacherous in the gray dawn light. Hart guided his mule carefully down the bank, testing each step on the uncertain surface, while behind them, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats grew steadily louder. Sheriff Doolin and at least 2 deputies were following their trail with the determination of men who knew their continued employment depended on success. The ice won't support the sled's full weight. Hart assessed after probing several spots with a broken fence rail. Too thin in some places where the current runs fast, too thick in others where it's trapped air. We go across on foot, single file, testing every step. He secured a rope around his waist like a mountaineer preparing for a dangerous climb, using the rail to probe ice strength ahead of each careful step. The first deputy's rifle cracked behind them, sending sharp fragments of ice flying from a spot mere inches ahead of Hart's boots. Keep moving forward. He called to Eliza, who was crawling carefully across the treacherous surface with one twin strapped securely to her chest. Talk to that baby. Keep her warm with your voice and your breathing. Eliza began humming a lullaby her own mother had sung years ago, the soft melody seeming to calm the infant, despite the chaos surrounding them. The simple act of singing gave her something to focus on, besides the deadly drop beneath the ice and the men with guns behind them. Hart returned fire with measured precision, not aiming to kill, but to keep the deputies cautious and their aim spoiled. His shot cleanly removed one man's hat, sending him diving for cover behind a fallen log, with curses that carried clearly across the frozen landscape. Ruth and Abigail followed in careful single file, the ice groaning ominously under their combined weight, but holding firm. Pastor Josiah brought up the rear, his face pale with fear, but his resolve steady. They were 3/4 of the way across when disaster struck with the sudden violence that characterized frontier life. One of the deputies, either braver or more foolish than his companions, spurred his horse directly onto the ice in an attempt to overtake them. The surface cracked like thunder, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. And both horse and rider plunged through into the black water below with a splash that sent spray flying like diamonds in the morning light. Sheriff Doolin immediately abandoned the drowning man to continue his pursuit, a decision that revealed the true nature of his character and his priorities. But Hart could not ignore mortal danger, even from an enemy who had been trying to kill him moments before. Some lines could not be crossed without losing one's humanity entirely. He threw the fence rail toward the struggling deputy with shouted instructions that carried clearly across the water. Grab the rail. Don't try to climb out, the ice won't hold your weight. Just hold tight until we can get you to shore. The deputy, his face already blue with cold and his strength failing, rapidly managed to catch the rail and pull himself onto more solid ice. Hart approached, carefully testing each step, and methodically removed the man's boots and gun belt. Tell your sheriff who saved your life today, Hart said, tossing the boots into the dark water where they disappeared with barely a splash. And tell him who abandoned you to die for the sake of politics. The bootless, disarmed deputy would have a long, cold walk back to town, but he would survive the experience. More importantly, he would remember who had shown mercy and who had shown betrayal when the moment of crisis arrived. At Enoch Boyle's modest farm, they found refuge in the root cellar beneath the main house, a cramped space that smelled of stored potatoes and damp earth, but offered both warmth and concealment from searching eyes. Enoch's wife Celia brought additional blankets and more goat's milk, though her anxious glances toward the door revealed her very real fear of Pike's inevitable retaliation against anyone who helped his enemies. He'll burn us out if he discovers you're here, she whispered to her husband, her voice tight with the kind of fear that came from living under the thumb of a powerful man who tolerated no opposition. Then we make sure he doesn't discover them. None. Enoch replied with more courage than his thin frame and nervous manner usually suggested he possessed. During the long afternoon hours, one of the twins developed a persistent cough that worried everyone present, a wet, troubling sound that suggested fluid in her tiny lungs. Celia disappeared without explanation and returned with a small bottle containing honey and herb mixture. For my son when he was sick last winter, she explained quietly. Miss Ruth provided it when we couldn't afford proper medicine from the territorial capital. The remedy helped significantly, and the baby's breathing improved within an hour. It was a small kindness during desperate times, but such gestures often mattered more than grand heroic actions when survival hung in the balance. As evening approached, Hart announced a decision that surprised and alarmed everyone present. I'm going back to town tonight. And that's suicide. Abigail protested with the vehemence of someone who had seen too many good people die from unnecessary risks. Doolin will arrest you the moment you set foot on Main Street. Possibly, Hart acknowledged. But Weller won't venture out here to the farm, too much risk for a man with Pike's debts hanging over his head. And we need that envelope opened with proper legal witnesses, or everything inside it becomes worthless paper. Hart's plan was straightforward, but perilous in its simplicity. He would approach Weller directly in the saloon, where the man spent most evenings, offering to pay off his entire debt to Pike in exchange for notary services. If Weller agreed, they would meet at the church at dawn with Abigail and Pastor Josiah, serving as official witnesses to whatever revelations the envelope contained. And if he refuses, Ruth asked, then we run for the territorial capital and pray we can stay ahead of Pike's men for a week of hard riding across country he controls. Hart rode back to Pine Needle as sunset painted the western sky, the color of blood, his injured leg throbbing with each step the mule took. The town appeared peaceful enough in the gathering dusk, but he could feel eyes watching from behind curtained windows, the kind of attention that meant everyone knew something important was happening, even if they didn't understand exactly what. The saloon bustled with Pike's men celebrating their expected victory, their voices loud with whiskey courage and the anticipation of easy money. Hart pushed through the batwing doors and walked directly to the bar, where Thomas Weller sat nursing a glass of rot-gut whiskey that probably cost more than most men made in a day. Weller was a small, nervous man, with thinning hair and ink-stained fingers, the kind of person who kept other people's secrets because he lacked the courage to have any of his own. He looked up in genuine surprise as Hart approached, his eyes widening with recognition and fear. "You heard you were wanted for kidnapping charges," Weller said quietly, his voice barely audible above the saloon's noise. "I heard you were drowning in debt to Pike." Hart replied evenly, his tone carrying no threat but plenty of certainty. "I'm offering you a way to reach dry land." Hart placed a leather pouch on the bar between them, his entire accumulated union pension saved meticulously over 13 years of careful living. The weight of the coins was significant, representing not just money, but security independence and the freedom to make choices without fear. Enough to clear your mortgage completely and provide breathing room besides, Hart said quietly. "All you need to do is notarize some documents at the church tomorrow morning. Simple paperwork, nothing illegal or dangerous." Weller stared at the money as if it were a mirage that might disappear if he looked away. "What kind of documents are we talking about?" "The kind that might displease Pike considerably when he learns about them. But once they're properly notarized and officially recorded, you'll be free of his influence permanently. No more mortgage payments, no more threats, no more jumping when he snaps his fingers." "What if Pike discovers I helped you?" Hart's smile held no warmth, but plenty of certainty. "Pike's about to face much larger problems than one bank clerk's actions. By tomorrow night, his attention will be focused on survival, not revenge." After several minutes of careful consideration, Weller nodded slowly. "Dawn at the church. Pastor Josiah and Dr. Merriweather as official witnesses." "Exactly right." Hart left the saloon and rode slowly back toward Boyle's farm, unaware that 3 of Pike's most trusted men were following at a careful distance. Their orders, simple and brutal: kill Hart quietly and bring back proof of his death. At the farm, the situation had deteriorated significantly during Hart's absence. Pike's foreman, Hank Clary, had arrived with two dangerous companions, Miguel Soto and Tuck Rowe, all of them armed and in an extremely ugly mood. Clary's left arm hung in a makeshift sling from his earlier fall, and his desire for revenge had only grown stronger during the painful hours that followed. They had searched Enoch's house with methodical thoroughness, questioning him roughly about Hart's whereabouts and the location of the woman and children. When Enoch claimed ignorance, Clary had struck him hard enough to split his lip and draw blood that stained the kitchen floor. "We know they're hiding somewhere on this property." Clary had growled, his voice thick with pain and anger. "Pike wants those babies delivered tonight, along with proof that Hart won't be causing any more trouble. We're not leaving empty-handed." Celia had managed to misdirect the searchers away from the root cellar through a combination of quick thinking and outright lies, claiming she had seen riders heading toward the creek earlier in the day. But time was running short before they would expand their search more systematically, and everyone knew the cellar wouldn't remain hidden for long under determined investigation. In the cramped underground space, Eliza held both twins close to her body, desperately trying to keep them quiet, despite their natural tendency toward crying and fussing. One small sound at the wrong moment would bring Pike's men down on them like hunting wolves, and she knew with crystal clarity that there would be no mercy shown to anyone who had defied Pike's authority. Outside, Miguel Soto was experiencing serious doubts about his continued involvement in Pike's increasingly violent schemes. He had joined the crew for steady wages and the protection that came with Pike's patronage, but beating women and stealing babies crossed moral lines he wasn't comfortable crossing. As the others prepared to resume their search with greater intensity, he quietly placed a small bundle of bread and dried meat near what he suspected might be the entrance to a hiding place food for desperate fugitives if they could retrieve it safely. The men finally departed as full darkness fell across the prairie, but they promised to return at first light with additional searchers and tracking dogs borrowed from the territorial marshal's office. The threat was not idle. Pike's influence extended into official law enforcement, and he had resources that ordinary people could barely imagine. Enoch emerged from his house with a swollen, bloody face and trembling hands, but his eyes held a determination that hadn't been there before. The violence had pushed him past fear into a place where ordinary caution no longer mattered. "They didn't find you," he said simply when Hart returned near midnight. "That's what matters most right now." When the small group huddled together in the lamp-lit kitchen to plan their next moves, Titus Harper's envelope sat unopened in Eliza's hands, like a talisman that might contain either salvation or bitter disappointment. The weight of it seemed heavier than the paper, and wax should account for as if it contained not just documents, but the accumulated hopes and fears of a father who had tried to protect his daughter from dangers he couldn't fully articulate. Whatever's inside had better justify the risks we're taking, Hart said, methodically checking his weapons with the practiced efficiency of someone who expected to need them soon. "My father was an extremely careful man." Eliza replied, her voice growing stronger with each passing hour. "He wouldn't have hidden something unless it was critically important to my survival and my future." But even as she spoke with growing confidence, they could all see the glow of torches moving in the distance like malevolent stars. Pike's men were already positioning themselves around the town's perimeter, establishing checkpoints and patrols that would make movement extremely difficult. By morning, Pine Needle would be under complete siege, and anyone who wanted to leave would have to fight their way out. The church bell tower offered an excellent view of the approaching dawn and the armed men who rode with it, like harbingers of violence. Hart could count at least 8 riders moving in coordinated formation toward the town center, while others had taken strategic positions at every road leading out of Pine Needle. Pike had decided to end this confrontation decisively, using overwhelming force to crush any remaining resistance and send a message that would discourage future opposition. Inside the modest wooden church that had served the community's spiritual needs for nearly a decade, Pastor Josiah lit candles with visibly trembling hands. The moral weight of what they were about to do, openly defying the most powerful man in the territory, was not lost on him. And he whispered prayers for guidance and protection as he prepared the altar area for their clandestine meeting. Thomas Weller arrived first, clutching his official notary seal and looking nauseated from nervous tension that had kept him awake most of the night. Dr. Abigail Merriweather came carrying her medical supplies and the leather ledger containing her meticulous documentation of Eliza's injuries, evidence that might prove crucial if they survived long enough to present it to honest authorities. Eliza sat in the front pew with both twins, who had mercifully slept through most of the night, and were now alert and feeding well from Ruth's patient ministrations. Ruth Fenwick stood beside them like a protective guardian angel, having spent the dark hours preparing additional clean cloths and warm milk for whatever challenges daylight might bring. "Are we all present and accounted for?" Pastor Josiah asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the sacred silence of the church. "Everyone who matters." Hart replied, positioning himself strategically where he could monitor both the front entrance and the stained glass windows for signs of approaching danger. Eliza broke the wax seal on her father's envelope with the appropriate ceremony such a moment deserved. Her hands shook slightly as she withdrew 3 items, a legal deed written on official territorial paper, and bearing multiple seals, a hand-drawn map of the local area that showed details no official survey had ever recorded, and a letter written in her father's careful handwriting that explained everything. Weller examined the deed first, his banker's trained eye checking the official seals and signatures for authenticity with the thoroughness of someone whose livelihood depended on recognizing forgeries. "This is completely legitimate," he announced with obvious surprise. "Properly witnessed and recorded with the Territorial Land Office exactly 5 years ago, just days before your father's death." Hart read over Weller's shoulder as the man recited the deed's contents in legal language that was complex but unmistakably clear in its meaning. Titus Harper had surveyed and legally claimed mineral and water rights to a crucial piece of land that included the spring where he had ultimately lost his life trying to save others from the flood. Upon his daughter's marriage or the birth of her first child, regardless of that child's gender, those rights would automatically transfer to her with Jacob Hart, specifically named as temporary trustee if protection became necessary. The spring sits on land Pike has been claiming as his own for years. Abigail observed, studying the accompanying map with growing understanding. Claims without legal ownership. Weller corrected with the precision of someone who understood the crucial difference between possession and legitimate title. According to this deed, the spring and 100-acre strip surrounding it belong entirely to Miss Warren. That includes comprehensive mineral rights and water access privileges that would be worth a fortune to anyone planning railroad development. Hart felt the pieces of Pike's scheme clicking together in his mind, like the mechanism of a precisely crafted rifle. Pike desperately needs that spring for his railroad development contract. Without guaranteed water access for steam engines and construction crews, the entire route becomes financially unprofitable, and his investors will pull their support. Titus Harper's letter provided the final pieces of the puzzle with heartbreaking clarity. He had suspected that powerful interests would attempt to claim his survey work after his death. So he had filed the deed in secret and instructed Abigail to safeguard it until his daughter either came of age or found herself in desperate need of protection. The letter also revealed that he had been receiving threats in the weeks before his death. Threats that suggested his accidental drowning might not have been accidental at all. But there was additional evidence that would prove even more damaging to Pike's schemes. Abigail opened her medical ledger and displayed detailed notes about Eliza's injuries, including precise measurements and observations that would withstand scrutiny in any territorial court committed to actual justice. "Examine this very carefully," she said, indicating a small evidence envelope that she had prepared with scientific precision. Inside was a tuft of red wool that she had methodically removed from Eliza's torn sleeve, along with detailed notes about its distinctive color and weave pattern. Hart studied the fabric fragment closely, his memory stirring with recognition. It was high-quality wool dyed a distinctive shade that would have been expensive and difficult to obtain on the frontier. I've seen this exact color recently, near Hank Clary's winter coat. Ruth said immediately, her teacher's memory for detail proving crucial. He was wearing it yesterday when they searched Enoch's property, and I noticed it particularly because the color was so unusual and expensive looking. The revelation struck everyone present, like lightning splitting the darkness. They now possessed physical evidence directly connecting Pike's foreman to the brutal attack on Eliza, combined with legal documentation proving her ownership of land Pike desperately needed for his railroad scheme. For the first time since this nightmare began, they had weapons capable of fighting Pike's money and corrupt influence. We need to present this evidence to the territorial court in Cheyenne. Hart decided, his military mind already calculating distances, travel times, and the resources they would need for such a dangerous journey. It's the only jurisdiction where Pike's money hasn't completely corrupted the legal system. That requires a week of extremely dangerous travel across territory Pike controls completely. Pastor Josiah pointed out, his voice heavy with the weight of harsh reality. He has men resources and the cooperation of local law enforcement. We'd be hunted every mile of the way. Then we'd better be prepared to fight for every mile. But before anyone could begin planning their escape route, the church doors burst open with sudden violence that shattered the morning calm. Sheriff Doolin entered with 3 heavily armed deputies, their weapons drawn and their expressions grimly determined. Nobody moved so much as a finger. Doolin ordered sharply, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate obedience. Hart, you're under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy against the peace and good order of this community. What assault? Hart asked with perfect calm, his hand resting casually near his weapon, but making no threatening moves. Deputy Mason. He claims you shot at him while he was performing his lawful duties as an officer of the court. Mason fell through the ice because he made a poor tactical decision. I saved his life afterward at considerable risk to my own safety. That's for a proper judge and jury to determine in a court of law. Hart noticed that the church had quietly filled with townspeople during their clandestine meeting. Word having spread through Pine Needle's close-knit community that something significant was happening. Curious residents had gathered to observe what they sensed might be a turning point in their town's history, and now they sat silently in the wooden pews as unexpected witnesses to a confrontation that would define their community's future. Sheriff Pastor Josiah said, stepping forward with surprising courage that seemed to draw strength from the sacred surroundings. This is God's house, consecrated ground. Whatever business you believe you have here can wait until we've completed our worship service. This isn't worship, Pastor. This is a criminal conspiracy against the lawful authority of this territory, and it ends right now. Then you won't object if we ask these witnesses to testify about what they've personally observed. Ruth said loudly, turning to address the gathered townspeople with the clear voice she used to command attention in her classroom. How many of you personally witnessed Jacob Hart rescue a woman and 2 newborn babies from freezing to death in the snow? Several hands rose hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as people realized they were not alone in their knowledge of the truth. Mobrahar Darbistar, how many of you saw Hart risk his own life to pull Deputy Mason from the ice after your sheriff abandoned him to drown? More hands rose and voices began to murmur agreement and support. And how many of you have personally seen or heard about Harlan Pike's men beating people who couldn't pay their debts or who dared to dispute his land claims? This time, nearly every hand in the church rose in unified defiance, and the murmur became a rumble of anger that had been building for years. Doolin's face reddened with anger and embarrassment as he realized that his authority was crumbling before his eyes. This constitutes obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit treason against territorial authority. All of you will face serious charges when this is over. For what specific crime? Demanded Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith's widow, whose husband had died under suspicious circumstances after refusing to sell his shop to one of Pike's associates. For telling the truth about what we've witnessed with our own eyes. The crowd's murmur of agreement grew stronger, and Hart realized that something crucially important was happening. Pike's control over the community had always depended on fear and isolation. People keeping silent about injustices because they believed they stood alone against overwhelming power. But when people stood together publicly and spoke truth before witnesses, that control began cracking like ice in the spring thaw. We're taking this evidence to Cheyenne, Hart announced loudly enough for everyone in the church to hear clearly. Anyone who wants to accompany us as witnesses to Pike's crimes is welcome to join this journey toward justice. Doolin raised his rifle in a threatening gesture, but found himself facing a church full of citizens who were no longer afraid of him or his corrupt authority. Slowly, reluctantly, he backed toward the door with his deputies. This isn't finished by a long shot. He warned, his voice carrying less conviction than he intended. No. Hart agreed quietly, his pale eyes holding steady contact with the corrupt sheriff's gaze. It's just beginning. After Doolin and his men departed with promises of swift and violent return, Thomas Weller quickly notarized copies of all the documents, while Pastor Josiah stamped them with the official church seal that would give them legal weight in any honest court. But their moment of victory proved tragically short-lived when someone shouted from the church steps. Through the windows, they could all see thick smoke rising ominously from the direction of Enoch Boyle's farm, black columns against the morning sky, that told a story of deliberate destruction and calculated revenge. The barn was already completely engulfed in roaring flames when they arrived, the fire far too advanced to save the building or the livestock trapped inside. The smell of burning wood mixed with the more terrible odor of dying animals, creating a stench that would linger in everyone's memory for years to come. Enoch stood in his farmyard with tears streaming down his weathered face, watching 13 years of backbreaking labor and careful saving turn to ash and acrid smoke. His wife Celia clutched their young son against her body, both of them staring in numb shock at the wanton destruction of everything they had worked to build. The boy was crying, not understanding why their animals were screaming or why his father looked so broken and defeated. Pike's men came just after sunrise. Enoch explained when Hart approached, his voice hollow with the kind of despair that came from watching a lifetime's work destroyed in minutes. Said this was what happened to people who harbored fugitives and criminals. Said it was a lesson for anyone else who might be thinking about defying Mr. Pike's authority. The message was brutally, unmistakably clear. Cross Harlan Pike, and everything you had worked for would burn to nothing, leaving you with ashes, and the knowledge that resistance led only to ruin. But Pike had made a serious tactical error in his choice of targets and timing. The destruction of Boyle's farm was so obviously vindictive, so blatantly the act of a man who believed himself above all law and human decency, that it pushed Enoch past fear and despair into the kind of cold, determined fury that could move mountains or start revolutions. I'm coming with you to Cheyenne, Enoch announced with quiet certainty, his voice carrying a strength that no one had heard from him before. Enoch, no. His wife protested desperately, her voice breaking with fear for her family's future. You have a wife and child to think about. What happens to us if something happens to you? I'm thinking about them, Celia. I'm thinking about what kind of world we're leaving our son if men like Pike can do this without facing any consequences whatsoever. Enoch's jaw set with determination that transformed his entire appearance. I'm thinking about whether I want him to grow up in a place where might makes right and decent people have to live in fear of bullies and thieves. But as they prepared to depart for the territorial capital, Miguel Soto appeared at the edge of the burned farmyard with information that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. Enoch never betrayed you. Miguel revealed without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of guilt and the desperate need for redemption. He went to Pike's ranch last night, but not to turn you in or collect a reward. He confronted Pike directly, demanding justice for his burned farm and threatening to expose Pike's illegal activities to territorial authorities. What happened to him? Hart demanded, his tactical mind already working through the implications. Pike made him an offer first: forgive all his debts completely in exchange for leading you and the women into a carefully prepared trap. When Enoch refused and started making threats about going to the law, Pike had him taken prisoner. Miguel's voice grew heavy with shame. Then Pike sent men to steal one of your babies as leverage to force your compliance with his demands. Eliza's face went white with terror so pure it seemed to drain all the blood from her body. Where is my daughter? Silver Knife Mine, about 5 miles north of here. Pike's been using it as a base while he digs a tunnel he claims is for water access, but everyone knows he's really trying to reach the mineral vein on your inherited land. Miguel met her eyes directly. The baby's alive. Pike isn't insane enough to harm an infant directly, not when she's worth more to him as a bargaining chip. But she won't survive long in those cold, damp conditions without proper care and feeding. Hart's military mind immediately grasped the full tactical situation with crystal clarity. Unable to legally claim Eliza's property through courts or contracts, Pike had decided to simply steal its valuable resources through underground tunneling, while using the kidnapped baby as irresistible bait to draw his enemies into a carefully prepared killing ground. The decision Hart made went against every survival instinct he had developed during years of frontier warfare and civil conflict. Instead of continuing toward Cheyenne and the relative safety of legitimate legal authorities, they would turn back and attempt to rescue both Enoch and the stolen baby from Pike's heavily defended mining operation. It's obviously a trap, Abigail pointed out with the practical wisdom of someone who had seen too many good people die from noble but foolish gestures. Of course it's a trap. Hart replied grimly, his pale eyes already calculating distances, approaches, and the resources they would need for what amounted to a military assault on a fortified position. But sometimes you have to spring the trap to win the war. A severe storm was building in the mountains to the west, bringing with it the promise of killing wind-blinding snow and temperatures that could murder an unprotected infant within hours. They had no choice but to move quickly, even if it meant abandoning the safety of legal process in favor of desperate direct action. The final confrontation was approaching with the inevitability of winter darkness, and everyone understood that not all of them would survive to see its resolution. The blizzard struck Silver Knife Mine like nature's own artillery barrage, transforming the world into a howling white nightmare where visibility dropped to arm's length and the wind carried voices away before they could travel more than a few feet. Hart crouched behind an overturned mining cart, studying the mine entrance through driving snow that stung his exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles and made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Pike had chosen his defensive position with the eye of someone who understood military tactics and the advantages of terrain. The mine was carved directly into the face of a steep rocky hillside, with only one practical approach that offered minimal cover for attackers. The wooden structures surrounding the entrance storage sheds, equipment shelters, and a small office building provided excellent firing positions for defenders, while leaving any assault force exposed to crossfire during their approach. I count at least 6 men positioned around the entrance. Hart called to his companions, who had taken shelter behind a collapsed supply shed about 50 yards from their target. Probably more inside the mine itself, and definitely more than we can handle in a straight fight. Their assault force had been reduced to 6 people through necessity and circumstance. Hart, with his multiple injuries and damaged leg, Eliza, desperate to recover her kidnapped child, Dr. Abigail Merriweather, carrying her medical supplies, and the moral authority of someone who had dedicated her life to healing Ruth Fenwick, who had refused to abandon them despite having no personal stake in the outcome. Thomas Weller clutching the precious legal documents that represented their only hope for legitimate justice, and Miguel Soto, who had chosen redemption over the safety of continued compliance with Pike's orders. "How do we get close enough to matter?" Ruth shouted over the howling wind, her teacher's practicality cutting straight to the heart of their tactical problem. Hart had been analyzing the same question with the systematic approach he had learned during 3 years of civil war and 10 years of frontier survival. A direct assault across open ground would be suicide. They would be cut down by rifle fire before covering half the distance to the mine entrance. But the storm that made their approach so difficult also provided the concealment they desperately needed if they were willing to stake everything on one coordinated gamble. "We go in 3 separate groups." Hart decided, his tactical experience overriding the physical limitations imposed by his injuries. "Miguel and Weller circle wide to the left with the legal documents. If the rest of us fail, you keep moving towards Cheyenne and make sure this evidence reaches honest authorities. Ruth and Abigail take the center approach with me, using that makeshift shield for protection. Eliza, I'm going after my daughter." Eliza interrupted with the absolute determination that only a mother's love could generate. "Nothing you can say will change that." "Then you come with the center group, but you follow orders and don't take unnecessary risks. That baby needs her mother alive, not dead from heroic gestures." Hart improvised a crude but potentially effective shield from a heavy wooden door that had been torn off one of the mine's outbuildings by previous storms. It wouldn't stop rifle bullets at close range, but it might deflect them or spoil an enemy's aim long enough for them to cross the most dangerous open ground. The first phase of their desperate assault began at the height of the storm's fury, when the wind howled with such violence that verbal communication became impossible except at shouting distance. Hand signals and predetermined plans would have to carry them through the most dangerous moments. Ruth and Miguel pushed the makeshift shield forward through the deep snow, while Abigail and Weller crawled behind it on hands and knees, protecting the precious legal documents from both enemy bullets and the destructive effects of wind and moisture. Hart limped alongside the formation, using his Spencer rifle to return fire whenever muzzle flashes revealed enemy positions through the swirling white chaos. Eliza took a completely different approach that demonstrated her growing confidence and tactical understanding. Armed with Hart's backup revolver and carrying a small lantern wrapped in cloth to prevent light from betraying her position, she worked her way along a ridge of mining debris and discarded equipment that offered concealment from the main defensive positions. The defenders opened fire immediately upon spotting movement through the storm, but their shots went wild in the blinding snow and howling wind. Accurate shooting became nearly impossible under such conditions, and even experienced marksmen found themselves firing at shadows in movement that might have been wind-blown snow rather than actual targets. Hart's return fire was more accurate than his enemy's efforts, not because he possessed superior marksmanship skills, but because he had learned patience and fire discipline during 13 years of frontier survival. Each shot was carefully aimed and timed, designed to keep the defenders honest rather than necessarily kill them. Eliza reached the wooden smokehouse where Miguel had indicated the stolen baby was being held. Her heart pounded with fear and anticipation as she carefully pushed open the door, not knowing what horrors she might find inside. She discovered her daughter alive, but dangerously cold, wrapped in inadequate blankets beside a dying fire that provided minimal warmth in the drafty building. Beside the baby, bound with rope and beaten severely enough to leave his face swollen and bloody, was Enoch Boyle. His eyes widened with relief and disbelief when he saw Eliza. "They're using your child as bait for a larger trap," Enoch whispered urgently as Eliza cut his restraints with a knife from her clothing. "Pike's waiting inside the mine with Doolin and at least 3 other men. They expect Hart to charge straight into the tunnel after you, and they've prepared a killing ground that will slaughter anyone who enters. Then we'll have to disappoint them." Eliza replied, her voice carrying a new authority and confidence that surprised even her. She wrapped her daughter close to her body for warmth and life, feeling the baby's heartbeat against her chest like a promise of hope. Their escape from the smokehouse was blocked when Hank Clary emerged from the mine entrance, rifle ready and hatred burning in his eyes like fever. His broken arm was still splinted from his earlier fall, but it was functional enough to aim and fire a weapon with deadly accuracy. "Thought you were clever, didn't you?" Clary snarled through the wind and snow, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm's noise. "Pike's been planning this trap for days. Every move you've made, every decision you've taken, we anticipated 3 steps ahead." What Clary hadn't anticipated was Enoch's desperate courage born from the destruction of his farm, and the knowledge that he had nothing left to lose. Despite his injuries and weakened condition, the farmer launched himself at Clary from behind, sending both men tumbling into the snow in a tangle of limbs and weapons. Clary's rifle discharged harmlessly into the air, but the sound drew immediate and unwelcome attention from the mine entrance and surrounding defensive positions. "Get that baby to safety," Enoch shouted, grappling with Clary in the snow and ice. "Whatever happens to me, get her away from here." The second phase of the battle erupted with sudden violence when Pike made his own crucial tactical error. Frustrated by his men's inability to stop the rescue attempt and angry at being denied the swift victory he had anticipated, he ordered the wooden bridge spanning a deep gulch near the mine entrance to be set ablaze. His plan was to trap Hart's group on the wrong side of the fire, forcing them to surrender or die in the flames. The fire spread rapidly through the dry timber of the bridge, creating a barrier of flame and smoke that cut off retreat routes and filled the air with the acrid stench of burning wood. But the fire also created light that revealed the defenders' positions, clearly allowing Hart to select his targets with much greater precision than the blinding snow had previously allowed. Sheriff Doolin, eager to prove his worth to Pike and secure his position, climbed onto the burning bridge with his rifle, seeking a clear shot at the rescuers below. It was a mistake, born of desperation and poor judgment. The bridge's support timbers were already weakened by years of weather, and the sudden intense heat of the flames and his additional weight caused the entire structure to sway dangerously. Hart spotted the immediate danger and acted with the quick thinking that had kept him alive through countless battles. Using a hand crank and rope system from the mining equipment, he managed to swing a heavy water barrel over the flames, dousing them enough to create a temporary passage through the fire. The action sent sharp pain through his injured ribs and reopened wounds that had been healing. But he ignored the agony in favor of keeping his people alive and moving forward. "Move now," he commanded with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "We have maybe 30 seconds before that bridge collapses completely." Ruth and Miguel pushed their protective shield across the smoking, unstable timbers, while Enoch, despite his injuries, provided covering fire from his position near the smokehouse. His shots were accurate and well-timed, forcing the defenders to keep their heads down during the crucial moments when the civilians were most vulnerable. A bullet caught Enoch in the side, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a wooden post. But he continued firing with methodical precision, his farmer's knowledge of hunting and pest control serving him well in this deadlier application, until all the civilians were safely across the bridge. Ruth stumbled halfway across, nearly falling through a gap where burning planks had given way to reveal the rocky gulch below. The fall would have meant certain death, but Eliza reached back without hesitation, grabbing Ruth's hand and pulling her forward with strength born of desperation. "Don't let go," Eliza said through gritted teeth, her voice carrying the iron determination of someone who had already lost too much to accept any more losses. "We're all getting out of this alive." They made it across with seconds to spare, the bridge collapsing into the gulch in a shower of sparks and burning debris that illuminated the snow-covered landscape like a vision from hell. The final phase of the confrontation took place inside the mine itself, where Pike had retreated with his remaining loyal men for what he intended to be the conclusive battle. The tunnel was partially flooded from melting snow that had found its way through cracks and fissures in the rock ceiling above. The wooden support timbers were old and rotting from years of moisture and neglect, and water dripped constantly from above, creating treacherous pools and unstable footing on the uneven tunnel floor. Hart and Eliza entered the mine together, leaving the twins safely outside with Abigail and the others standing guard against any remaining threats. Hart carried a lantern to provide illumination in the tunnel's darkness, while Eliza held his backup revolver with hands that no longer trembled, hands that had found steadiness through necessity and purpose. The tunnel stretched deeper into the hillside than Hart had expected, with several side passages that could conceal additional enemies or provide escape routes for their quarry. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of rotting timber, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a tomb than a place where living people might work or fight. They found Harlan Pike waiting for them in a wider section of the main tunnel, a natural cavern that had been expanded and reinforced to serve as an underground office and storage area. He was using Thomas Weller as a human shield, holding the terrified bank clerk in front of his body, while a pistol pressed against the man's temple. Sheriff Doolin crouched behind an overturned mining cart with his rifle trained on the tunnel entrance, while the wounded Hank Clary leaned against the rock wall with a pistol in his functional hand, his face twisted with pain and the desire for revenge. Jacob Hart. Pike said in a conversational tone that seemed completely inappropriate for their circumstances, as if they were meeting at a church social rather than in a flooded mine tunnel during a gunfight. I must admit, you've caused me considerably more trouble than I anticipated when this business began. Release Weller. Hart replied evenly, his rifle steady despite the poor lighting and treacherous footing. Your quarrel is with me alone, not with innocent bystanders. My quarrel, Mr. Hart, is with anyone who threatens my legitimate business interests and the prosperity I'm trying to bring to this territory. Pike's voice carried the cultured tones of an educated man, someone who had learned to wrap cruelty in polite language. This mine provides access to the mineral vein on Miss Warren's claimed property. Legal ownership may be merely paperwork from one perspective, but physical possession is what actually matters in the real world. Eliza stepped forward into the lantern light, studying Pike's face clearly for the first time since the night of her attack. Something about his features, the shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes, triggered memory fragments from that horrible experience. You were there personally, she said suddenly, her voice carrying growing certainty and controlled anger. The night I was attacked. I couldn't see faces clearly through the pain and darkness, but I recognize your voice now. You were giving orders. A very perceptive young lady. Yes, I was present to ensure the job was completed according to my exact specifications. Pike's smile held no warmth, only the satisfaction of someone who took pleasure in others' suffering. I wanted to make certain you understood the consequences of disappointing me and the importance of producing what I required. You murdered my husband. Pike shrugged with casual indifference that was more chilling than open hostility would have been. Silas was weak and potentially problematic for my long-term plans. I eliminated him preemptively as a matter of simple business efficiency. Nothing personal, you understand. But before Pike could continue his casual confession, Pastor Josiah's voice echoed from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system, carrying words that struck Pike like physical blows. Tell them about the letters, Pike. The correspondence Silas brought to me before you had him killed. Pike's confident expression flickered with genuine surprise, and something that might have been fear. What are you talking about? Pastor, what letters? Silas discovered your correspondence with Judge Baines and other territorial officials. Letters discussing systematic bribery, forged legal documents, planned murders, and other criminal activities stretching back years. Pastor Josiah emerged from a side tunnel, his face grim with the weight of knowledge he had carried in secret. He was gathering evidence against your entire operation when you had him murdered. But Silas was smarter than you gave him credit for. He made copies of everything and hid them in the one place you would never think to look. Where? Pike demanded, his composure finally beginning to crack. The church collection box sealed and dated witnessed by God and the entire congregation during Sunday services. Every piece of evidence needed to expose how your corruption reaches all the way to the territorial capital and beyond. This revelation hit everyone present like a physical blow, rewriting everything they thought they knew about recent events. Silas hadn't betrayed his wife. He had been trying to gather evidence against Pike's criminal enterprise when he was murdered for getting too close to the truth. The documents Pastor Josiah described would expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. But Pike had one more secret to reveal, and his eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction, despite his deteriorating position. You think you've won some kind of victory here. Even if you escape this mine alive, even if you somehow reach Cheyenne with your precious evidence, it won't matter in the end. Why is that? Hart asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. Because none of you were supposed to survive this night. Pike replied with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. I have arrangements in place with certain territorial officials who have just as much to lose as I do if this evidence becomes public. Even if my local operation is compromised, you'll never live long enough to testify in any court. Miguel Soto, who had been quietly positioning himself behind Sheriff Doolin during the conversation, suddenly spoke up with a voice heavy with guilt and determination. He's telling the truth about the plans to kill everyone. Miguel confirmed his admission, carrying the weight of someone seeking redemption through confession. I heard Pike giving the orders myself. After we recovered the baby and eliminated Hart, we were supposed to make it look like an accident, a mine collapse that killed everyone inside. No witnesses, no evidence, no loose ends. The confrontation exploded into desperate violence. When Hart, realizing that negotiation was pointless with someone who intended to murder them all, regardless of the outcome, kicked loose a crucial wooden wedge that had been holding back accumulated water from a major crack in the tunnel wall. The sudden flood sent everyone scrambling for higher ground as the tunnel floor tilted under the pressure of rushing water that transformed their battleground into a deadly, chaotic nightmare. The lantern's light danced wildly across wet rock walls and panicked faces as the combatants struggled to maintain their footing on increasingly treacherous terrain. Sheriff Doolin's rifle shot went wide in the confusion, shattering Hart's lantern against the tunnel wall and plunging them all into complete darkness, broken only by the occasional muzzle flash of weapons firing blindly in the chaos. Hart and Eliza crawled toward the tunnel entrance through rising water and falling debris, counting support timbers by touch exactly as Hart had taught her during their first desperate escape from Pike's men. Behind them, they could hear Pike and Doolin struggling against each other in the dark water, their alliance dissolved by desperation and the instinct for individual survival. Outside the mine, Miguel Soto made his final moral choice, with the clarity that sometimes comes to people in moments of ultimate crisis. When Sheriff Doolin emerged from the tunnel entrance, gasping and panicked by his near-death experience underground, Miguel put a single, carefully aimed bullet through the corrupt lawman's heart. For all the innocent people you helped destroy over the years, Miguel said quietly, watching Doolin collapse into the snow that was already beginning to cover his body. Inside the flooding tunnel, Hart and Pike fought hand-to-hand in the dark, frigid water. Not the heroic, choreographed combat of adventure stories, but the clumsy, desperate struggle of two injured men trying to kill each other with whatever weapons they could improvise from their surroundings. Pike was younger and less severely wounded, but Hart had learned brutal, efficient fighting techniques during 3 years of civil war, where gentlemanly rules meant death. When Pike attempted to drown him by forcing his head underwater, Eliza struck the rancher with the broken remains of the lantern frame, stunning him long enough for Hart to break free and reverse their positions. But Hart was badly injured, barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion, his strength failing rapidly in the cold water. It was Eliza who took command of the situation, now her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been transformed by necessity into a leader. "To Jacob, stay with me," she commanded, pulling him toward the tunnel entrance as water continued rising around them. "Count the support timbers like you taught me. 1, 2, 3. We're almost at the entrance." A major support beam weakened by years of water damage, and the stress of the sudden flood chose that moment to give way, with a tremendous crash that shook the entire tunnel system. The beam fell directly across Pike's position, pinning him in the rapidly rising water with no possibility of escape. "Help me." Pike gasped, his arrogance finally replaced by terror as death approached with cold certainty. "I'll give you money, more wealth than you can imagine. I'll sign over everything I own, make you partners in all my business ventures." Hart and Eliza looked down at him without pity, their faces illuminated by the faint light filtering in from the tunnel entrance. "You'll get justice." Hart managed through exhaustion and pain. "The same justice you gave to everyone else who got in your way." They left Pike trapped in the collapsing tunnel and crawled toward daylight and survival. Behind them, the mine gave way entirely as rotted timbers and water-weakened stone finally surrendered to forces that had been building pressure for years. There was no explosion, no dramatic collapse worthy of a dime novel. Just the quiet, inevitable failure of a structure that had been built on fundamentally rotten foundations, much like Pike's entire criminal enterprise. The storm had passed by the time they emerged from the mine, leaving behind a world washed clean by snow and rain that sparkled under emerging sunlight like a promise of redemption. Dr. Abigail Merriweather knelt in the snow beside Enoch Boyle, working desperately to save a man who had sacrificed everything for people he barely knew. The bullet wound in Enoch's side was serious, but not immediately fatal, and Abigail's skilled hands worked to control the bleeding while she assessed the damage to internal organs. "Hold on, Enoch," she murmured with professional calm that masked her personal concern. "Your son needs his father to come home, and your wife needs her husband." But Enoch was already looking past her toward the clearing sky, which had revealed the first stars of evening through the breaking clouds. His breathing was shallow but peaceful, and his eyes held the calm satisfaction of someone who had finally found the courage he had been seeking all his life. "Tell my wife I kept my word to her and to myself," he whispered with the effort that speech now required. "Tell her the bad men can't hurt our family anymore, and that our son will grow up in a world where decent people don't have to live in fear." He died holding Hart's scarred hand, having discovered in his final days that heroism was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act righteously despite being afraid. Ruth Fenwick gently covered Enoch's face with her own woolen shawl, while Miguel Soto surrendered his weapons to Hart and requested permission to testify against Pike's entire criminal operation in exchange for whatever mercy the law might offer. Thomas Weller emerged from the collapsed mine entrance with the precious legal documents intact, though thoroughly soaked with tunnel water. The papers remained legible and legally binding, still proof of Eliza's rightful ownership of the land that Pike had died trying to steal, and evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond one man's greed. The journey back to Pine Needle was somber, but filled with the quiet satisfaction that comes from surviving a great trial and emerging with principles intact. Word of Pike's death had spread rapidly through the network of communication that connected frontier communities and townspeople gathered in the street to witness the physical proof that their long nightmare was finally ending. Ruth rang the church bell to summon the entire community together, and Pastor Josiah read aloud from the pulpit both Pike's confession and the contents of the letters that Silas Warren had hidden in the church collection box. The evidence revealed systematic corruption, bribery, and criminal conspiracy that had infected territorial government for years, reaching far beyond Pine Needle to include judges, territorial officials, and business associates throughout Wyoming territory. 2 neighboring ranchers who had witnessed Titus Harper's original land deed stepped forward to publicly support Eliza's legal claim, no longer afraid of Pike's retaliation against anyone who opposed his interests. Miguel's detailed testimony provided additional evidence of the criminal conspiracy, while Dr. Merriweather's medical records offered irrefutable physical proof of the violence used to enforce Pike's will. Within a week, a territorial marshal arrived from Cheyenne in response to telegraphed reports of the incident. Marshal William Crawford was an honest lawman who had built his reputation on bringing justice to remote areas where corruption had taken root, and he reviewed all the evidence with the thoroughness of someone who understood its larger implications. This investigation is going to reach a lot further than one dead rancher and his local operation. Crawford warned the townspeople gathered in the church. Pike's correspondence reveals connections to criminal activity throughout the territory, and there are going to be arrests and trials that shake the territorial government to its foundations. The legal resolution came more swiftly than anyone had expected, aided by the overwhelming evidence and the territorial government's desire to distance itself from the scandal. The territorial court in Cheyenne ruled that Eliza's deed was completely valid and binding, granting her clear legal title to the spring and mineral rights that Pike had coveted for his railroad scheme. More significantly, the court's investigation revealed that Pike's entire claim about requiring a male heir for his business ventures had been pure fabrication from beginning to end. The railroad contracts contained no gender requirements whatsoever. Pike had invented that restriction solely to terrorize local families into surrendering their legal rights and submitting to his authority. The corruption investigation ultimately reached the territorial capital and beyond, resulting in the arrest of Judge Baines and several other officials who had accepted bribes in exchange for legal decisions that served Pike's interests. Significant reforms were implemented to prevent similar abuses in the future, including new oversight procedures for territorial judges and requirements for public documentation of all major land transactions. With Pike dead and his criminal organization completely exposed, Pine Needle began the difficult but hopeful process of rebuilding itself on honest foundations. The burned bridge was reconstructed using salvaged timber and community labor, then officially named Boyle Bridge in honor of the farmer who had given his life for justice and the protection of innocent people. Enoch's widow Celia received sufficient compensation from Pike's confiscated assets to rebuild her farm and purchase new livestock, along with enough additional funds to ensure her son could receive a proper education. The territorial government, eager to demonstrate its commitment to justice, provided generous reparations to all of Pike's victims who could be identified and located. Miguel Soto received a 6-month sentence for his past association with Pike's criminal gang, but the punishment was suspended in recognition of his cooperation and courage during the final confrontation. Ruth Fenwick wrote a persuasive letter to the territorial governor requesting executive clemency, and Miguel was released after serving only 2 months of his sentence. Dr. Abigail Merriweather was officially appointed as the county's chief medical examiner. Her meticulous documentation of Pike's crimes having proved crucial in securing justice for his victims. Her clinic received territorial funding for proper medical supplies and equipment, allowing her to expand her services to communities throughout the region. Ruth Fenwick used her growing influence to establish a new school that would serve children from throughout the county, her reputation as someone who had stood courageously against corruption, making her a natural leader in the community's recovery and growth. But the most significant changes involved Eliza herself, and the ways in which her traumatic experiences had transformed her from a victim into a leader. As the legal owner of valuable mineral and water rights that were crucial to the region's development, she found herself in a position of considerable power and influence that she was determined to use responsibly. The railroad company still wanted to build their line through the area, bringing economic development and connection to the outside world that could benefit everyone. But now, they had to negotiate with Eliza as an equal partner in the enterprise, rather than attempting to steal or manipulate their way to what they wanted. Eliza made a decision that surprised many people, but demonstrated the wisdom she had gained through suffering and struggle. She asked Dr. Abigail Merriweather to serve as co-trustee of her inherited property, sharing both power and responsibility. rather than concentrating all authority in a single person's hands. I've witnessed firsthand what happens when one person controls too much power over other people's lives. She explained to the community gathering that had been called to discuss the railroad negotiations. Even good people with honest intentions can make mistakes or be corrupted by too much authority. Shared power means shared accountability, and that benefits everyone. In practical terms, the railroad development proceeded through legitimate negotiation and legal contracts rather than through corruption and violence. The route was modified to pass through public land, where possible, with Eliza granting water access easements that benefited the entire community, rather than enriching any single individual or interest group. The fence line where their terrible ordeal had begun looked entirely different now, covered with melting snow that revealed fresh green grass underneath and the promise of spring renewal. Hart stood watching as Eliza played with her twin daughters under a beautiful blanket that Ruth had woven from wool, contributed by every family in Pine Needle, as a symbol of community support and shared commitment to a better future. The babies were healthy and growing rapidly, their delighted laughter carrying across the prairie like music that celebrated life's victory over death and hope's triumph over despair. They would grow up in a world where justice mattered more than wealth, where courage was valued above compliance, and where communities stood together against those who would prey upon the innocent. Hart's injuries still caused him considerable pain, especially the old war wound that would never fully heal no matter how many years passed. He would always walk with a pronounced limp, always carry physical reminders of the violence that had shaped his life and the promises he had made to dying men. But those scars had also taught him crucial lessons about when to fight and when to show mercy, when to stand alone, and when to trust, and in the strength that came from community lessons that had made the difference between achieving justice and seeking mere revenge. Eliza looked up from her children, studying Hart's weathered face, with eyes that had witnessed too much suffering, but still held genuine hope for the future they were building together. I've been thinking seriously about what comes next for all of us. She said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned to make decisions under pressure and accept responsibility for their consequences. Hart nodded, understanding that decisions made during desperate moments needed careful reconsideration during calmer times. The trust and partnership between them had been forged in crisis and tested by fire. But lasting relationships required much more than shared danger and mutual dependence. The fence needs proper mending, he observed, indicating the broken rails that marked the boundaries of her property and symbolized the damage that had been done to their community. Yes, it does. And the cabin needs a completely new roof before next winter arrives. The spring house requires rebuilding from the ground up, and there's extensive survey work to complete on the mineral claims before we can finalize the railroad contracts. Eliza's voice carried the practical planning of someone who understood that the future had to be built one careful step at a time. Hart listened to her comprehensive list, understanding that she was offering him a genuine choice about his role in that future, rather than making assumptions about his plans or obligations. If you ask me to stay and help with that work, I'll do it gladly and give you the best effort I'm capable of, he said with characteristic honesty. If you prefer to handle things independently or with other partners, I'll ride north in the spring and return with supplies whenever you need them. Either way, you'll have my support and friendship. Eliza considered his words, carefully weighing the lessons that recent experiences had taught her about the value of genuine independence, balanced against the critical importance of trustworthy allies and partners. Hart had proven himself reliable and honorable during their worst crisis, but she needed assurance that he would respect her authority and judgment during peacetime, as well as war. Stay today, she decided after thoughtful consideration. Tomorrow we'll see what tomorrow actually brings, and we'll make decisions based on what we learn together. It was a practical answer from a practical woman based on real circumstances and honest assessment rather than romantic fantasy or unrealistic expectations. Hart nodded his acceptance, recognizing genuine wisdom when he heard it, and understanding that the best partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than desperate need. There's something else that needs to be said. Eliza added her voice, carrying the authority of someone who had learned to speak difficult truths clearly. This community has learned something crucially important about the power that comes from standing together against corruption and injustice. I want to make absolutely certain that lesson isn't forgotten when times get easier and memories fade. She gestured toward the town of Pine Needle, where children now played in streets no longer shadowed by fear, where honest business was conducted without threats of violence, and where people could speak their minds without worrying about retaliation from powerful interests. We're going to establish a permanent community council with representatives from every family in the area, she announced. Decisions that affect everyone will be made by everyone together, rather than by one powerful person whose word becomes law through force or fear. The land rights I inherited will fund not just personal prosperity, but a school that serves all our children, a medical clinic that treats anyone who needs care, and public works projects that benefit the entire community. Hart smiled with genuine warmth, the first completely unguarded expression of happiness he had shown since the ordeal began. Your father would be proud of the woman you've become, and the leader you're choosing to be. Our fathers would both be proud, Eliza corrected, including Hart in the family legacy she was building. They would see that their sacrifices and their promises meant something lasting and worthwhile. In the distance, Pine Needle bustled with the honest activity of a community rebuilt on solid foundations. The school bell rang to call children to classes where they would learn not just reading and arithmetic, but the civic virtues of courage, justice, and mutual responsibility. Dr. Merriweather's newly painted sign announced her expanded practice and commitment to serving anyone in need, regardless of their ability to pay. The solid timbers of Boyle Bridge spanned the creek, where corruption and cowardice had once flourished, now replaced by integrity and community solidarity. Wooden stakes marked the boundaries of public water access rights, ensuring that no future Harlan Pike could monopolize resources that belonged to everyone. The church stood proud against the vast Wyoming sky. Its collection box, now holding community funds, contributed voluntarily rather than evidence of criminal conspiracy hidden in desperation. Hart picked up his tools with hands that had held weapons in defense of the innocent, and would now build structures to shelter and protect the community they had helped to save. Behind him, Eliza sang softly to her daughters, while Ruth prepared lessons for children who would grow up understanding that democracy required constant vigilance, and that justice was not a gift bestowed by the powerful, but a right that had to be defended by ordinary people working together. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain in its details, but no longer dominated by fear or the arbitrary will of those who confused wealth with virtue. They had faced the worst that corruption and greed could offer, and had emerged with their principles intact, their community stronger, and their faith in human decency restored. In the end, that represented victory enough. For anyone, victory that would echo through generations and remind future citizens that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to stand together for justice and refused to bow before those who would make themselves kings through violence and intimidation.